We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Welcome to After America. I'm Dr Emma Shortis, Director of International and Security Affairs at the Australia Institute. And I made it to the United States. I'm here in Washington, DC. I arrived on Halloween, but I'm not going to indulge in cheap metaphors about that, tempting as it might be. Our first guest, while I'm here though, isn't actually in the United States. He's currently in Athens, and he's a great friend of the Australia Institute. Professor Yanis Varoufakis is a visionary economist, the former finance minister of Greece, a tireless political leader, and a best-selling author. Yanis and I spoke about the campaign, the lack of democracy in the United States, and what this all means for the rest of the world. Here he is now. Yanis, thank you so much for joining us on After America.
My great pleasure, Emma.
The pleasure is all ours. Yanis, I wanted to start by asking you, given that we're only a few days out now from the US presidential elections, what you think this election campaign tells us about the state of American democracy.
It reminds us that there is no such thing. Democracy is a system of government which requires a degree of connection between power and the majority, which has been designed out of our liberal democracies right from the beginning, even with the American Constitution. If you read the American Constitution and go beyond the beautiful, wonderful preamble, especially if you delve into the Federalist Papers, you will realize, if you have an open mind, that the whole point of the American Constitution is to ensure that the demos is not running the democracy, that through representative systems, essentially an oligarchy with frequent elections maintains control over the important decisions. Now, that has always been the case. Nevertheless, that doesn't mean that things have not changed in recent years. In my view, Emma, I always make the point that 2008 was a particularly crucial juncture in the history of the West and in particular in the United States, because you had the wholesale collapse of Wall Street and you had this massive bailout of the financial sector, which created an even larger and thinner wedge, which essentially separated further the demos for what passes as democracy. Let me remind you that Barack Obama was elected right at the cusp of the 2008 disaster with Yes, We Can. And he inspired a lot of people to believe that things can now change, that the idea of democracy can come closer to the reality of the American political system. And instead, the first thing that Barack Obama did was to appoint the very same men who had brought about the criminality of Wall Street, people like Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, to run the economy again and essentially to do two things at once: to spread austerity amongst the many and simultaneously to create socialism for the bankers and for the very few. To cut a long story short, Trump is a product of Obama. This total betrayal of hope, of the Yes, We Can rosy period, which lasted for a couple of months during and after the election of Barack Obama, gave rise to such discontent and such a wholesale inability of the majority of Americans to believe the fiction of the American Constitution, that we have a situation now where I personally think, between you and I, that most of the people who vote for, not all of them, but most of the people who vote for Donald Trump, they know that he doesn't believe in anything, that he cannot be trusted, that life will end up worse for them probably as a result of a Donald Trump presidency or second presidency. But they are so peeved with the whole political system that they ask themselves one simple question. who should I vote for if I really want to piss off the establishment? And the answer is Donald Trump, so I'll vote for him. It makes no difference in any case to my life who is president, because it's a one-party state. That party has different factions, but when it comes to the vast majority of the view, I'm not telling you that this is exactly how it is, but how most people who vote for Trump feel. And I think that is the fundamental development following the 2008 crisis, which, for my generation, it's the equivalent of 1929, in the same way that 1929 created a rupture. Nothing after 1929 can be explained in terms of things that were happening and were considered as conventional wisdom before 1929. I think the same thing applies now.
And Yanis, in a lot of the coverage of the election, and I think even the coverage that would agree with your assessment about the longer history of the Democratic Party and it being mostly really responsible for Trump, still defines this election as the election of the century, the most important election in at least living memory in the United States. Do you think that the possibilities of November 5, given what you've just said, do really represent this inflection point in history in a similar way to 1929, for example?
Look, I'm very reluctant to declare the forthcoming election, whichever that might be, the pivotal election of the era. Because let's face it, we are fallible human beings and we have an intrinsic bias towards thinking that what we are doing today is the most important thing that has ever happened in the history of humanity or that will ever happen again. Now, I can understand from the perspective of the democratic establishment, the establishment of the Democratic Party, and also from the perspective of the Republicans, the never-Trump Republicans who have flocked to the Democratic Party, like the Cheneys, even Schwarzenegger, that for them, a defeat of Trump would allow them to think that it's business as usual, that they go back to the normal situation where you have the center left and the center right, the different factions of the one-party state competing with one another. So it would be a great relief to them because there is no obvious heir and successor of Trump. So if Trump is now vanquished, they can go back to business as usual. That's what they think. So for them, it is probably the most important election in their lifetimes. For women, especially women of reproductive age, it is equally important, and rightly so, because if you're a woman and you live in the United States, Trump is a clear and present threat to your body and therefore to your mind. If you are Muslim, if you are darker skinned, let's say, again, it really matters a lot. If your visa status is precarious, it is the most important election that you can ever imagine, because there's no doubt that Trump is going to weaponize racism and expel many people who have actually nowhere to go. So I don't want to discount the importance of this election, but at the same time, I want to urge people not to fall in the trap of thinking that just because we are in the here and now, that this is the most important and poignant moment in history.
It's hard to resist that temptation of the present. Given that and what you just said about the Democratic establishment, I suppose, and their interest in this election, there's been a big effort to, I suppose, rehabilitate President Joe Biden's image, especially when it comes to foreign policy, when he sort of stepped aside. How do you think Biden's presidency will be remembered, whatever happens in this election?
Oh, Biden is going to be remembered as an utter and unmitigated catastrophe when it comes to foreign policy. Let's not forget, I think we have a moral, ethical duty to make the point that he has been the chief enabler of the genocide which is going on in Palestine. And this is not good for Israel. If you're a liberal, progressive Israeli, you should be up in arms. because this is effectively the end of any prospect that you can live in a liberal democratic society in Israel as an Israeli Jew. Let us not speak about what you should think if you're a Palestinian who is being subjected to bombing, torture, incarceration, starvation, death by thirst. We are talking about possibly the greatest war crime, the greatest crime against humanity since the Second World War. And Biden, well, he's got his paw prints all over that. The war in Ukraine is being lost, and it is a complete failure of the Biden administration way of pursuing that war, of ensuring that there would never be any serious negotiation. It is clear now that the Biden administration stepped in the first few months after Putin's illegal and criminal invasion of Ukraine. And it was, however, Biden that for the first few months, there was a peace process going on. There was a possibility of a ceasefire and of the prevention of a never-ending war, which will leave Ukraine devastated. And Biden, because it was in the interest of the United States to turn this into a never-ending war, is going to be held responsible in the annals of history for devastating the Ukrainian people, and in the process, doing a great deal of damage to the reputation of the United States in the global South. The contrast and the juxtaposition between the war in Ukraine and the massacre, it's not even a war in Gaza, it's just a daily massacre, one-sided massacre. That contrast will make it absolutely impossible for anyone not to burst out laughing when Washington talks about international law, human rights, and the United Nations Charter. There's no way anyone in the world can take seriously the idea that it is wrong to bomb a hospital in Mariupol, but it is self-defense to do it in Gaza.
And we've spoken a few times before on this podcast about to use a terrible old CIA term, the blowback effect of that on American democracy as well, because it may mean, for example, that Harris loses Michigan, and you can already see the groundwork being laid there to blame the left for that loss rather than to blame the Biden administration's foreign policy, which is, of course, a very familiar tactic.
Indeed. We saw this after 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost essentially due to her own crucial errors, the presidential election to Donald Trump. The democratic establishment proved beyond reasonable doubt that it possesses no capacity to throw critical light on its own failings. And instead, a wholesale blame game commences. And I'm afraid that this is exactly what's going to happen again.
Yeah, I think so too. To continue on that theme, I suppose, of the United States' role in the world, you've been writing about US empire and hegemony for a long time now. What do you think has changed, if anything, since you wrote The Global Minotaur in 2011? Is the United States still hegemonic, and can it remain that way?
It is still hegemonic, as long as it continues to hoover up from the rest of the world a very substantial percentage, more than 50%, of capitalist profits generated by the rest of the world's capitalists, and hoover them up in the form of monies that flow voluntarily from German capital, French capital, Japanese capital, and of course, even to this day, during the new Cold War, Chinese capital. The money floods into Wall Street. It subsidizes the debt of the United States government in the form of treasuries, real estate, and so on and so forth. That was the point of that book of mine, The Global Minotaur, this amazing model of hegemony, because it's the very first time in the history of humanity that you have a power like the United States, which gets stronger the more it gets into the red. Every other empire before that collapsed when it got into the red. The United States, the more they go into the red, the more hegemonic they are. And of course, this all turns on the monopoly of international payment systems, the monopoly of the dollar as not so much a reserve currency, but the currency of transactions. So if you want to send money from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world, you have to go through SWIFT, you have to go through a system that is owned by the United States. So this is why their hegemony is getting grounder and grounder. The point I made in that book that you so kindly mentioned was that in 2008, and that's why I'm going back to this idea of 2008 as a harbinger of tremendous changes. The United States economy in 2008 maintained, despite the crisis, the capacity to essentially suck out of the rest of the economy, of the world economy, a lot of surplus value and to recycle it to its benefit, but it lost its capacity to recycle it in the form of investment. So, when a Chinese capitalist who makes money by selling aluminum to California, this money is, of course, IOUs, which are also known as dollars, freely printed by the Fed. So the Chinese businessman gets this money in dollars, sends them back to the United States and buys, let's say, real estate in Miami. That's not investment. This is not investment in productive assets. So the recycling continues, which maintains the hegemony of the United States, except that we now have much lower levels of investment in the West because Wall Street no longer has the capacity after 2008. That capacity broke down in 2008. What capacity to turn these values that percolate within the financial circuits of Wall Street and the City of London, which is attached to Wall Street, to turn them into investments. And this is what we are now observing. You have in China, productive investment, which is skyrocketing. In the West, in Europe and in America, we can't build anything anymore. The United States cannot even build those damned submarines that they promised to Australia. They can't even build them for themselves. If they want to create, let's say that tomorrow morning, whoever gets elected as president, decides to build a super fast railway from New York to Los Angeles, well, they can't do it. They don't have the expertise. They don't have the capital goods. They don't have the labor, the engineers to do it. We have been deindustrializing in the West as a result of this massive failure to not only the fact that the West shifted productive capacity to China, but beyond that, we have not been converting, not even to the level that we used to before 2008, money into investment.
Do you think Trump is in part a product of that deindustrialization, as you've outlined, and has he, well, maybe not so much he, but the people around him have quite radical responses to that? He's planning, for example, to put fairly significant tariffs on Chinese goods coming into the United States, and some of the more radical kind of libertarian wing of his loose coalition also has a long-term kind of generational aim to dismantle the Federal Reserve. What do you think would be the consequences of a Trump administration, both for the US and the global economy, but for the processes that you've just outlined there?
I think it's important to go back to 2016 and compare the mad, sad, and crazy narrative with what happened. People say that this time will be different. Whenever I hear that expression, I always turn the skepticism on. But I was very surprised during his first term, Emma. I remember hearing him say, "I'm going to tear up NAFTA, the North Atlantic Free Trade Association, that Clinton had done so much to put together, that effectively creating a common market a single market between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And he turned against it and said, I'm going to tear it up. I didn't believe it. I didn't believe he would do it. And he did it. Shockingly, truly shockingly, and I say this with fear and trepidation, but let's be honest, the one that he replaced it with was better. It was better for Mexicans, it was better for Americans. Because what he did was, instead of slapping tariffs on cars produced in Mexico and imported or exported into the United States, what he did, I don't know whether you remember that, he did something quite remarkable. He introduced a $15 American per hour minimum wage in North Mexico. So essentially saying to the American companies or Volkswagen and so on, if you want to produce in North Mexico, you're not going to be underpaying the workers. So there are two ways of stopping multinationals from taking advantage of a developing country. One is to introduce tariffs, and the other is to raise wages. And he did that. Some people say to me, why is it that so many union workers are supporting Trump? Well, because, it's something I would have done. So there is a contrast between the madness in the narrative, the evil, purely racist, misogynic evil in the man, and some of the policies that have been other policies were mad and crazed, like for instance, the ban on traveling from certain Muslim countries to the United States. So he will do that in order to appease his Nazi racist xenophobes in there. But then he will do other things which I find more interesting. He's never going to dissolve or dismantle the Federal Reserve. That is a joke and a half, because he understands very well that his own social class depends very much on the support of the Federal Reserve. And there would be no J.P. Morgan today. I mean, after all, J.P. Morgan created the Federal Reserve because he could no longer shoulder the job of bailing out all the other idiotic bankers. So there's no way he will do that. This is in order to keep the libertarian base interested. So yeah, let's see what happens after November.
Yeah, it's not long now until we will know. Yanis, one of the things you just mentioned then, I know it was an aside, but is real estate in Miami. And that is increasingly becoming less of an investment because parts of Florida in not too long will be underwater and are subject to hurricanes of increasing intensity. We've seen that quite recently. Why do you think it is, given what's happened in the United States, given how bad hurricane season has been this time around, that climate doesn't appear at least to be a factor in the election? It's not featuring in the Democratic Party's campaign, and to the extent it features in Trump, it's that, climate change is a woke conspiracy and he will undo all of the Biden administration's climate action. Where is climate in this election?
Well, it's not even in the agenda of Kamala Harris.
No.
It's completely absent. So if it's absent, it's not on CBS, it's not on CNN, it just doesn't exist. The Democrats have not managed to put on the agenda the one area where Joe Biden had something to say, not of course that it was a green agenda. The IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, was a pro-business agenda. It was not a pro-environment agenda, but he did give a lot of money, and it was interesting that it was uncapped. Unlike European schemes, which are always capped, and the cap is always much lower than the official cap. In the case of Biden, it was the opposite. It's limitless. Just go for it. So it's amazing that the Democrats didn't even try to capitalize on the one good thing that was nestling in the IRA legislation. But Emma, there is no democracy in the United States. I'll go back to what I was saying at the beginning. Because if there were democracy, given that 70% of Americans want gun control, gun control will be on the agenda. So when 70% want something and it's not on the agenda, what do you expect with climate, which is not even in the mind of 30%? That is not going to go on the agenda, as long as the fossil fuel industry maintains, like the Israeli lobby, almost a strict control over what is being discussed in the House and in the media.
I think I know the answer to this given what you've just said, but I'm going to ask you anyway. In your most recent book, in Techno-Feudalism, you argue quite rightly that a deal between the United States, the European Union, and China and others is a kind of basic prerequisite for limiting climate warming levels to levels that consistent with our survival. Do you think that is still possible? Is there still hope for that kind of agreement in the context, especially of an increasingly hostile relationship between China and the United States?
Possible, one hopes. But there is a huge gap between possible and likely. Emma, we live in an utterly irrational world. Think about it. We have only one country that can produce solar panels that we need for the green transition in low prices and huge quantities. That's China. And what is going on? Washington, D.C. is essentially instructing the European Union to put gigantic tariffs on them and not to use them, when at the very same time the European Union has not invested for the last 20 years in solar panels. So falling behind and we can't even produce them. Now that is, if an extraterrestrial were to approach planet Earth and take a look at what we're doing, notice that our climate is falling apart, that we have hurricanes, that we have droughts, that we have Spain going from drowning to dying of thirst, as you saw recently. The extraterrestrial will be aghast at the stupidity of our species for doing exactly the opposite of what is necessary in order to complete the green transition. So with the European Union becoming increasingly irrelevant and incapable even to organize a piss up in a brewery, as my English friends say, the future of the planet depends on an agreement between the United States and China. And both political parties, both factions of the single political party that is running the United States, are gung-ho that they want a Cold War, maybe a hot war, with China. You see, in the end, the only difference between Biden and Trump, or Harris and Trump, and the people behind them, their teams, regarding the war in Ukraine, for instance, the only difference is, the Democrats and the neocons within the Republican Party that are not with Trump, who still support the perpetuation of the war in Ukraine, what they're saying is that in order to contain China and to conduct the Cold War against China, we need to stop Putin in Ukraine. And what the Trump people are saying is that Ukraine is a distraction. It damages the capacity of the United States to wage war against China. So both of them agree on a war against China. In other words, both of them agree that this planet must be doomed, because any kind of war between the United States and China, whether it's Cold War, hot war, or lukewarm war, it means that we are going to miss our last chance to reverse the process of climate catastrophe, to stop the planet from going past the point of no return.
It's hard. It is hard to be hopeful, isn't it?
It's very hard.
Given all that you've said about the long history of democracy or not democracy in the United States, the prospects for global cooperation, the role of China and US primacy, what do you think the lessons of this campaign and that longer history should be for countries like Australia and democracies in Europe as well, especially in terms of how we approach and understand our relationship with the United States?
Well, we have an opportunity. Australia has an opportunity to be the adult in the room. And it's not taking it. By tying its colors to the mast of the United States, unthinkingly, slavishly. It is missing out on a magnificent opportunity to bring some sanity and some rationality to the table, to bring the United States and China together by, signing the AUKUS treaty in the case of Australia, and by essentially expanding NATO until there is no tomorrow in Europe, until we're pushing all the way into the underbelly of the Russian bear. Essentially, what we're doing is we are missing out on the opportunity that we have as Europeans, as Australians, as New Zealanders, to join countries like South Africa, which, they are not enamored of Russia or China for that matter, but they are more rational than we are. They understand that becoming vassals of the American hegemonic empire is detrimental not only to our countries, but to the prospect of humanity.
Lessons I hope we'll be able to learn. That gap between likelihood and hope is a big one, but hopefully we can make it a bit smaller. Yanis, thank you so much for your time at such a busy and critical time for the rest of the world. We really appreciate it so much.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on Friday, the 1st of November, US time, and some things might have changed by the time you hear it. If you're enjoying After America, please help us spread the word by telling your friends about the show. You can find us on social media. We're at the Oz Institute, that's with an AUS, on Twitter and Instagram. And you can reach out to us with feedback and episode ideas via our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. And if you want to hear more from Yanis, he visited Australia as a guest of the Australia Institute earlier this year, and several of his talks and events are linked in the show notes and available on our website. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.